On the approach of the Austrians, an insurrection broke out, and Monsieur Fouché was obliged to withdraw. The emperor commissioned him to proceed to Naples to advise the king, whose position had become delicate. But instead of devoting his attention to the interests of France, Monsieur Fouché was entirely occupied with his own. He negotiated and availed himself of the opportunity to obtain payment of some claims he had on the Duchy of Otranto. If he himself may be believed, he acted still more improperly, since he has boasted of having fixed the irresolution of Murat and decided him in favor of the coalition. If instead of employing the ascendancy which he had over that prince to conquer the remaining shame which still withheld him from this course, he had induced him to march against his enemies and ours, who knows the turn which affairs might have taken? Who knows whether the Allies would have dared to pass the Rhine? Besides, had this determination made no change in the concatenation of events, they would at least both have done what it was their duty to do. Murat, especially, for that prince was of the number of those whose position so distinctly chalked out their line of conduct that any departure from it, any equivocal attitude, was a base treason. A throne cannot be kept after the loss of honor, for there is no rest on a dishonored throne. Chapter 21. I perceived the danger on all sides so pressing, and at the same time so few efforts made to overcome it, that I determined to speak on the subject to the emperor. He himself furnished me with an opportunity after a levee at St. Cloud. He asked my opinion on the state of affairs. I answered that they could not be worse, and what was more, that the intention of the Allies were evident, that they could not be misunderstood, and that they had resolved upon his ruin. You believe so? He said earnestly. I know it, sire. Your Majesty is necessary to the repose of Europe, but the passions do not look to the future. Whatever gives them present gratification is good, provided they are satisfied. It matters little what happens after. Assuredly, Austria ought not to take part in these plots, but Metternich knows on what conditions he has bargained with England, and he also knows that you cannot remain ignorant of the compact. It is therefore his own throne that he is defending, and for his own power that he is struggling. He will carry everything to extremities if your Majesty do not hasten to prevent him. The emperor listened, as if he expected that I should state some remedy. I added, there is but one, sire. There is an assemblage of diplomatists with their conventional arguments and traditional forms. We must employ one of their own sort against them. Monsieur de Talleyrand? Yes, sire. Then you will have the same logic, the same morals, the same religion. You cannot do better. But the Duc de Bassano? The Duc de Bassano is entirely devoted to you. But he belongs to another school. Here the emperor interrupted me and proceeded to eulogize the good qualities of the Duke. I know, said I, all that your Majesty has done me the honor to tell me, and it is because I do know it that I advise the choice that I have suggested. He now understood me clearly and ordered me to go immediately to Paris and bring Monsieur de Talleyrand to him. I got into my carriage and drove off to execute the commission with which I was charged, but apparently what I said to the emperor had made a considerable impression on his mind. For while I was with the Prince of Benevento, a page arrived bringing him an invitation to St. Cloud. I was persuaded that Monsieur de Talleyrand was about to become minister, but on my return to St. Cloud in the evening, I learned from the emperor himself the turn which the affair had taken. He had approved very much of all that Monsieur de Talleyrand suggested, and after a long conversation proposed to him to take the direction of our foreign affairs, on condition, however, that he should resign his office of Vice Grand Elector. Monsieur de Talleyrand was willing to accept of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but would not agree to the required resignation. He observed that to diminish his consideration on giving him a place to which he was recalled at a moment when it was more difficult than ever to discharge its duties was to deprive him of a means of usefulness. He therefore hesitated, and the emperor came to no conclusion. The conversation, however, continued. Mr. de Talleyrand, who knew the object which had been aimed by all the preceding coalitions was not deceived respecting the views of the present. He related to me that he said to the emperor, "Here is your work destroyed. Your allies, by successively abandoning you, have left you no other alternative but that of treating without loss of time, treating at their expense, and at all hazards. A bad peace cannot be so fatal to us as the continuance of a war which must be unsuccessful. Time and means to recall fortune to your side are wanting, and your enemies will not allow you a moment to breathe. There are, however, among them different interests, which we should endeavor to bring in conflict, private ambitions, present means of which we might avail ourselves to prepare a diversion." The emperor asked him to explain himself, and Mr. de Talleyrand continued, "There is in England a family which has acquired a distinction favorable to the encouragement of every kind of ambition. It is natural to suppose that it possesses ambition, or at least that by showing disposition to second its ambition, we may excite in it the desire of elevation, and also that there are in England a sufficient number of adventurous men to run the chances of its fortune. At all events, such a proposition could do us no harm. On the contrary, if it were listened to, it might bring about changes which would soon place us in a state in which we would have little to repair. Another consideration is that your allies having failed you, you can now do nothing solid except with new men connected from the beginning with the conservation of your system." Emperor listened to Mr. de Talleyrand, but desired him to speak out more plainly, remarking that he was always the same, and that there was no knowing what he would be at. Thus pressed, Talleyrand mentioned the Wellesley family, and said, "Look at Wellington, who may be supposed to have something in view. If he submit to live on his reputation, he will soon be forgotten. He has several examples before his eyes, and a talent such as his will not be stopped so long as there is something left to be desired." The emperor did not adopt these suggestions. He observed that before helping the ambition of others, it was fit that he should be in a condition to make himself respected in his government, and added that at the present moment he could give his attention to nothing else. Mr. de Talleyrand, however, told me that the emperor appeared much impressed with what he had stated. He indeed expected that the emperor would have again spoken to him on the subject. Mr. de Talleyrand has been blamed for not making, on such an occasion, the sacrifice required of him. His having made conditions when the exertion of his talents was so much wanted has been much condemned. It is always easy to blame, but in this case the blame was not merited. Mr. de Talleyrand knew his situation. He suspected that same enmity which had long pursued him would soon procure his removal. In that case, if also no longer vice grand elector, he would have been reduced to a very destitute situation, for he had suffered greatly by a bankruptcy which took place in the preceding year. He very reasonably observed that when the emperor applied to him, if he meant to have no reserve, he ought not to have withheld any proof of his confidence. He expected that whatever might give him security would be granted to him. On the contrary, as he had not that security, it became his duty to take care of himself, and to avoid being reduced to a very disagreeable situation. He therefore did not choose to divest himself of a rank which was his safeguard, and the project of placing him in the foreign department went no farther. The appointment was given to the Duke of Vicenza, to whom an influence in the court of Russia was then attributed. The emperor also removed the Duke of Massa, Monsieur Regnier, from the Ministry of Justice, and the Count de Sassay from the Ministry of War. He was not satisfied with either, but Monsieur Regnier was aged. He had lately experienced an attack of apoplexy and was menaced with a second. The emperor feared that it might occur while he was absent, therefore made him president of the legislative body and chose for his successor in the ministry Count Molay, who was then inspector general of bridges and causeways. The emperor had a great partiality for Monsieur Molay. He had for a long time wished to place him in a situation in which he would have more frequent intercourse with him, and although Monsieur Molay had no intimate acquaintance with the laws, he placed him at the head of the magistracy, because there are places which seem to be made for names, as there are names which are made for places. This was the case with M. Molay. His appointment was the subject of much observation, for there were many candidates for the place, but when the days of misfortune arrived, M. Molay justified the opinion the emperor had formed of him. The emperor had no complaint to make against M. de Sassac. But as the Duke of Bassano resumed the office of Secretary of State, it was necessary to provide for Count Daru, who was therefore appointed to the War Department. Mr. Daru had been all his life employed in the military administration and was therefore particularly well calculated for this office. He had followed the armies and was perfectly well acquainted with their mechanism. He was besides much younger than M. de Sassac, to whom the emperor gave the retiring rank and pension of a minister of state. These three changes were made on the same day at the end of November. They did not long sustain the hopes of the public, but the appointment of the Duke of Vicenza gave particular satisfaction. He was considered the advocate of peace. He immediately opened, as I have already stated, a correspondence with M. de Metternich. He gave to the basis transmitted by M. de Saint-Aignan an adhesion as complete as our minister had desired, but while the reply was expected, time passed away, and the prospect of the future became every day more adverse. Chapter 22. The emperor, who had not been deceived respecting the views of the allies employed in the preparation of means of defense, the time was spent by those about him merely in expressing their hopes of a happy change. He was more unremitting in his exertions to assemble an army, equip it, and put it in a condition to take the field. He garrisoned the fortresses of the old frontier, which had not been thought of since 1795. But his orders and his provident measures served only to show the paucity of his resources. All that formidable line of fortresses, which like a girdle encircled France, was nearly disarmed. The artillery with which they were once supplied had been transported to the fortresses of the new frontier and conveyed from place to place as far as the mouth of the Elbe and the Vistula. Incredible efforts were made to supply places which were absolutely destitute, and to remove all that could be collected to the points most exposed to danger. The government evinced extraordinary activity, which was, generally speaking, seconded as far as possible by the population, but public zeal was damped when the picture of our dangers arose before us. A demand was raised for arms from one extremity of France to the other, and instead of this demand being answered by a supply, the few muskets which the National Guard yet retained were taken to form a magazine for the supply of the army. The want of draft horses for the artillery was another circumstance which occasioned great embarrassment. Recourse was had to all sorts of unpleasant means of accelerating supplies, which could not be made speedily enough and conformably with the forms prescribed in the regulations. Complaints were heard on all sides, and the resistance of inert force was everywhere opposed to the government. The emperor clearly saw what was approaching. I firmly believe that in those trying moments he formed a just estimate of the men who 6 months previously had told him in full council that they would consider him dishonored if he ceded a single village which had been united to the empire by a senatus consultum. He also knew how to appreciate those who wished to deceive him respecting the real state of affairs. Yet these men very well knew the situation of France, and if instead of obeying the dictates of silly pride or interested zeal, they had given utterance to the complaints which resounded in their ears, how many misfortunes might have been spared. But the exclusive favor of the emperor was the sole object of their ambition. They were mortified if they saw him speak twice to any man who was accounted superior in talent to themselves. They immediately took measures to get rid of such men, and they never rested till they accomplished their purpose. The result of this fatal system was soon obvious. Truth gave place to flattery, zeal and enthusiasm fled, and the empire fell. Our misfortunes were not the work of those who had originally caused them, but the result of an obstinacy which those very individuals were unable to subdue. They shield themselves under the pretext of having exerted a degree of firmness and opposition foreign to their natures, but in vain. Their names are inseparably connected with public calamities, and our posterity will see whose hands wrought the destruction of that edifice of glory, which we proudly hoped to transmit to them unimpaired. Those men who are destined never to show themselves on the field of battle are always most eager for war. They seek to appropriate to themselves the honor and respect which are the reward of those who incur danger. They weigh the talents and courage of a general, and if they cannot reduce these qualities below the ordinary level, they describe him as an unprincipled spoliator. How often have I heard such backbiting addressed to the emperor respecting men whom he was known to esteem, and when the calumny had taken effect, the injured parties were informed by their detractors that reports had reached the ear of the emperor, who, in consequence, had conceived unfavorable impressions which their friendly efforts had been unable to erase. I have frequently heard the emperor impose silence to these slanderers, and I have often observed him reading angrily the reports of the general officers who fancied they were giving him proofs of attachment by calumniating their comrades. A great number of these shameful instances of detraction came to my knowledge, and the only reproach that can be fixed upon the emperor is that of having been kind even to weakness to men who sought his favor only from base and interested motives. They crouched to him for their own purposes, but they entertained no regard for him, or at least they had none of that enthusiastic devotedness which they unceasingly professed. I have already observed that the emperor, on seeing the host of difficulties that surrounded him, did not deceive himself with respect to the results to which his situation might expose him. Of this the following is a proof. He placed no confidence in the sentiments expressed in the declarations of the allies. He had said long before, "They have appointed my grave as their place of rendezvous, but none of them will venture to come first." He now added, "Their time of rendezvous has arrived. They think the lion dead, and the question is, who will give the ass's kick? If France abandon me, I can do nothing, but she will soon repent of doing so." He conceived it to be impossible, but that the allies should know with tolerable accuracy the difficulties with which he had to contend, and he was well aware that the circumstances, far from creating any pacific disposition on their part, only inclined them to extend their demands. But this consideration, far from discouraging him, served only as a fresh stimulus to his activity. His conduct on this trying occasion serves to show what may be effected by genius such as his. We may judge what he would have done had he been supported. Fate seemed to have proportioned the weight of his misfortunes to his power of endurance. Nothing astonished him or shook his firmness. The emperor resolved to bring the affairs of Spain to a close. Had he done so 2 months earlier, there's no doubt, but he would have averted his calamities, for the Spanish army might have been in Burgundy when the Allied forces arrived on the frontiers of Switzerland. He mentioned this plan to Cambaceres, by whom it was decidedly approved. The Minister for Foreign Affairs was ordered to direct immediate attention to it. The minister applied to me for permission to enable Monsieur de la Forest, who belonged to the Department of Foreign Affairs, to visit Valenciennes and remain there whenever he thought fit. He also applied for a passport for the Duke de San Carlos, who had been separated from the Prince of the Asturias while Mr. Fouché was in office, and who resided at Lons-le-Saunier in Franche-Comté. The Spanish princes lived in perfect retirement at Valenciennes. However, all their movements were well known, and those who know anything of Spanish manners will readily believe that it was unnecessary to resort to any disagreeable measures for the purpose of observing them. There was as much intrigue at the little court of Valenciennes as ever there was at Madrid. The confidence of the prince was as great a subject of competition as the viceroyalty of Mexico. The most ambitious courtier was always ready to sacrifice his rival, and that rival would readily have had recourse to any means of getting rid of the person he feared. The Spanish princes were therefore never watched by me, except through those competitions. It was only necessary to make use of one's eyes and ears, and I therefore recommended that they should be allowed full freedom. I was very glad to be thus exempt from the necessity of adopting those coercive measures which the general state of affairs would perhaps have authorized. On one occasion only I experienced a little difficulty. The Prince of the Asturias suddenly conceived a violent passion for riding on horseback, though previously he had shown but little inclination to go out, and when he did, went always in a carriage. I felt a little embarrassed, for though I was not to be made his dupe, yet I was unwilling to deprive him of the amusement which he seemed anxious to enjoy. I took my measures accordingly. His saddle horses all at once fell into a most wretched condition, so that whenever he wanted to ride, one was lame, another had a nail in his foot, etc. As he was not much of a horseman, many of these little accidents were attributed to himself, though they were the work of a man who was employed to keep the stud in this continual state of inefficiency. The trick succeeded, and at length his Highness's riding fit left him, which I was very glad of. I neglected no opportunity of communicating to the Prince of the Asturias any intelligence which was calculated to interest him, and I endeavored to banish that spirit of intrigue which so often connects itself with misfortune, and which I thought was likely to lead him into difficulties. The Emperor particularly recommended me to treat the Prince with all the respect that was consistent with my duty. Chapter 23. Trifles were now contended for at Valencia, notwithstanding that all parties were agreed upon the principal point. The idea had certainly occurred of demanding from the Prince of Asturias the cession of Catalonia, but it was wisely considered that any advantage that might be taken of his situation to require sacrifices opposed to his dignity and indicative of restraint on his part would be affording him, on his reaching Spain, a pretext for breaking all his engagements. It was consequently determined that the princes of the Spanish House of Bourbon should return to Spain, and that King Joseph, the Emperor's brother, should resign all the pretensions he might have to the throne of that kingdom in virtue of the anterior acts acknowledged by all the powers of Europe, with the exception of England. The Prince of Asturias engaged on his part to maintain peace between the Spanish and the French nations, and in furtherance of this object to withdraw all the Spanish troops which were serving with the English army, and in short, not to allow a passage through his dominions to any foreign troops attempting to invade the French frontiers. This arrangement was signed by both parties, and no attention seems to have been paid to the good faith displayed by the Emperor in concluding it. No doubt would be entertained on this point if a correct appreciation could be formed of the difficulties he met with from his brother, and the pressing entreaties he had to urge before he could prevail upon him simply and unreservedly to renounce his pretensions to that crown. The Emperor, who did me the honor to mention the subject to me, said that in a discussion with his brother, who obstinately resisted his wishes, he had addressed these words to him: "One would really suppose that I am robbing you of your portion of the inheritance of the late king our father." Marshal Berthier was alone acquainted with all these details, having been commissioned by the Emperor to follow up the negotiations with King Joseph. The most unaccountable circumstance is that when everything had been agreed upon, and when such earnest endeavors had been made to bring about an arrangement which allowed of the disposal of forces nearly double the amount of what the Emperor had at command, so much tardiness was suddenly displayed in carrying it into effect that it proved of no advantage to us in the crisis of our affairs. Monsieur de St. Carlos had brought back the treaty from Valencia, and yet no progress had been made since the opening of the negotiations in preparing to take advantage of the clauses which were to be adopted. Never was any time of more value to us than the present moment. Never was a danger so pressing. We had felt no apprehension at the loss of the Confederation of the Rhine. Some months before, in consequence of the withdrawing of Marshal Augereau's corps from the frontier of Bavaria for the purpose of uniting it to the main army, and on this occasion when the very existence of France was in danger, the necessity was overlooked of ordering the army in Spain to adopt a similar movement when it was yet in time to reach the theater of events, where its presence would have altered the aspect of affairs. It cannot be sufficiently regretted that the emperor's orders should have been ill executed and even eluded for self-interested purposes. I will state what I have ascertained on the subject through the channels of information at my command in order to clear up this enigma, or at least to unravel much of the obscurity in which it is involved. It will be seen that the spirit of intrigue had not slumbered, and that the safety of the state was not considered an object of paramount importance. The emperor had desired me not to neglect any means calculated to procure him positive intelligence of the plans of the allied armies. I happen to have the facility at my command of bringing about an intercourse between a person attached to my service and one of his friends, who followed the headquarters of the coalition and had free access to the Chancery Department of Prince Schwarzenberg. I accordingly dispatched him through Switzerland to the hostile army, the formation of which was in the Brisgau afforded a sufficient indication of its views. This person wrote from Bau to advise that I should exert all my influence to procure the immediate destruction of the bridge over the Rhine at that town, either by purchasing it of the Swiss or in any other manner. We had no time to make this suggestion the subject of a regular negotiation, which would necessarily have been acted upon by the influence of the enemies, who could not have looked at it with indifference. The proper time for purchasing the bridge was after the defection of Bavaria, when it should have been immediately destroyed. The person I have alluded to returned in all haste to Paris and informed me of all he had ascertained in the camp of the enemy, who was preparing his offensive movement towards the frontier. I then thought it my duty to become importunate until the emperor should have taken measures and issued instructions respecting the conduct to be pursued by the local authorities in case of an invasion, which I considered as being about to take place. I urged this point with so much perseverance that I was at last attended to, and a council was expressly held to discuss it, independently of the ministers at the head of departments who were present at this council. The emperor summoned to it ministers of state and the high dignitaries of the empire. I urged the dangers to which the territory had been exposed at the early period of the revolution, and that to the energetic measures of the then existing government was owing the gigantic display of forces which had preserved the state from ruin. I laid great stress on the magnitude of the danger, which was as urgent as the time for averting it was short, and I warmly urged the necessity for the immediate exertion of every means calculated to excite a national movement, without which we must expect the most serious misfortunes. I represented the conduct of the Austrians when we had occupied their provinces. They had exhibited the sound policy of issuing instructions to all persons in civil employments and making them remain at their posts. The latter established regularity in every transaction. It must be admitted that they were thus made available to our own purposes, but they preserved the country from greater evils, and above all, they watched over the persons they were appointed to superintend, and by their presence and authority kept them within the bounds of duty. I was here interrupted by a member of the council, who observed to me that the Austrians had never afforded us so much facility to take possession of their country as by leaving each public servant at his post, that we ought to be on our guard against imitating their example, that when they found the local administrations had fled, they would be compelled to disorganize everything and would thus be obstructed at every step of their progress. Notwithstanding this observation, I still insisted upon the necessity for the persons in civil employments being allowed to remain at their posts and being provided with instructions to perform with a good grace what they would be unable to refuse if coercive measures were resorted to. I added that this system would be beneficial to the country and would save it from plunder, and that, on the other hand, should fortune present a favorable opportunity for a general rise, it might the more easily be resorted to, and there would be no difficulty in fixing upon those who were to promote it. No public functionary would then venture to disown the authority that would address him, of whatever nature might be the orders transmitted for his guidance. I remarked that we were now in a very different position from what Austria had been placed in. It was no doubt true that if the government of that country had withdrawn its civil servants on our approach, we should have been greatly embarrassed to find substitutes for them, because her population did not present so many well-informed men as were to be found amongst the French people. But this was the very reason for avoiding to imitate her conduct. By removing the public authorities, we should deprive ourselves of the many means of information and many levers for setting the people in motion, if an opportunity offered, without at all succeeding in arresting the progress of the enemy, because any councillor of a prefecture or any person in a civil employment on the spot would be sufficient to carry on the machinery of the service to as great an extent as would answer the enemy's purpose. I added that those provisional functionaries would not endanger their lives in our service, the less so as they would always have a ready excuse to refuse complying with what might be required of them, even supposing that there were any means of finding them out. The conclusion, in short, which I drew from all these observations was that there would be much less disadvantage in leaving the local ministrations in the exercise of their respective duties. This particular view which I took of the subject was not concurred in by the council. It was still believed that their removal at the moment of the enemy's approach would impede their progress. They were instructed to quit their respective residencies according as the enemy should approach. I was greatly disappointed at this determination, being fully aware of the intentions of the Allied sovereigns and clearly foreseeing that this measure would be rather beneficial to them than otherwise. The council also came to the resolution of sending a commissioner of government to each military division in order to excite a spirit of emulation and endeavor to rekindle that national energy which had formerly produced such wonderful effects. These commissioners were received with every manifestation of goodwill, but hope was banished from every mind, without which enthusiasm is of no avail. The springs of public energy were worn out. The general feeling was one of perfect resignation to whatever fate might determine. In some parts of France, no doubt, there was seen an occasional spark of the sacred fire. Nevertheless, the call for arms was to be heard from one extremity of the country to the other. The cry of treason met the ear in all quarters. The minister of war was accused, and it cost me some pains to do away with the unfavorable impression he had made upon many. It is very true that the manufactories of arms were at a stand. Everyone asked how it happened. In such a pressing emergency, the idea had never occurred of establishing a manufactory of arms in Paris, as it had been done during the Revolution. How those of Liège, Charleville, Maubeuge, and Alsace had not been sent to Paris in order to establish the general depot in the capital. Had this measure been resorted to immediately after the Battle of Leipzig, the manufactory of Paris, with the assistance of the multitude of workmen who abound in it, might have supplied 2,000 or 3,000 muskets a day. This would have been sufficient to save France. And as the Minister of War had voted for the continuation of hostilities, it behooved them at least to consider of the means best calculated for vigorously prosecuting it. It must, however, be admitted that he had more work on his hands than he could find time to attend to, and it was difficult to foresee the rapid march of events. I have often heard him say that he thought it a great act of folly not to make peace. He then repented of the advice he had given on the return from the campaign in Russia. The commissioners deputed by government were not all able to reach their respective destinations, some of them having met the enemy on their way. Our preparations, however weak, had nevertheless created a due impression upon the Allies. They trembled lest the nation should take part in a contest carrying on, and they neglected no means of spreading false reports in every direction. The defensive measures resorted to were stigmatized as projects of conquest. They affected a language of moderation, whilst they had an army 6 times as numerous as that which the emperor could bring against them. They were in the very heart of France, and yet presumed to charge him with ambition, and to arraign him for having called upon the French to come forward in defense of their homes and families. Everyone had taken leave of his senses. The artful language of the enemy was mistaken for truth, and the emperor's warnings were rejected. The opening of the legislative body, which had been adjourned from day to day, was at last fixed for the 20th of December. The emperor felt desirous of making to that assembly a communication of the reply he had received from the allies. This was one of the motives which had so long delayed the opening of the session. That ceremony took place in the forms used on preceding occasions, and the emperor pronounced the customary speech. It appeared to me defective so far as it did not dwell sufficiently on the events which had brought about the existing crisis of affairs. The public mind of France was too much engaged in the consideration of past and present occurrences to be satisfied with the simple statement made to the legislative body, and I have always been of opinion that it would have been far better not to present any than to conceal a single circumstance, or to speak more correctly, than to abstain from showing it the most unbounded confidence, since the least inconvenience that could result from such a reserve would be to excite the hostility of that body, which would seize the first opportunity of curtailing a power which alarmed it and forced it to yield to the ascendancy of public opinion. The members of the legislative body had been a full month in Paris, where they had been overwhelmed with the various false reports scattered over that city. They expected to receive a communication which would remove the impressions they had imbibed from everything that had reached their ears. In the absence of such communication, their prejudices remained unchanged. They were nevertheless flattered at being made acquainted with the state of the negotiation. Though they discovered that some documents had been concealed from their knowledge, this circumstance was of itself quite unimportant, but was taken advantage of by the members as a pretense for continuing to mistrust the government. It is fair to own that nothing was easier than to influence the assembly, because it was not yet personally indisposed against the emperor, and still less unwilling to refuse concurring by every means in its power to extricate the nation from the crisis in which it was involved. I repeat it, the legislative body was not influenced by an unfriendly spirit. There were some discontented individuals among its members, but the majority were flattered at being called upon to attend a sitting which promised opportunities to some of ingratiating themselves into favor, and to others of displaying their patriotism and talents. The slightest exertion of skill was sufficient to discover the bias of their sentiments. This requires to be explained in more detail. Chapter 24. I have already mentioned that the emperor had appointed to the presidency of the legislative body the Duke of Massa, whom he had lately removed from the Ministry of Justice. The sessions of the legislative body were always circumstances laid hold of by intriguers as favorable to their views. They took care beforehand to spread uneasiness amongst its members, and after having gathered a harvest from the seeds which they had sown, they hastened to sound the alarm in the ears of those who came in contact with government. The latter, who were directly interested in the successful issue of affairs, never failed to make a confidential report on the subject in which they quoted their authorities. This was one of the ways resorted to for making an exhibition of zeal for the emperor's service, and for obtaining to be placed on the favored list. The stay which the members of the legislative body had made in Paris had afforded a wide field for the schemes of intriguers. And as the generality of such characters are jealous of everyone, they took care on this occasion to ascribe to the influence of those individuals whom they dreaded, or were desirous of injuring, all the sinister intentions which they fancied they had discovered amongst a few members of the legislative body. I narrowly watched the progress of events, without endeavoring to bias the actions of anyone, as it is necessary to be thoroughly convinced that others are in error before we can attempt to set them right. It often happens that when we desire to lead a person in any particular way, we often engender mistrust. Another direction will then be followed through a spirit of opposition. This is what actually came to pass in the circumstance now alluded to. The Duke of Massa had been represented to the emperor as incapable of directing the measures of the assembly in time of so much difficulty. It was alleged that his mental faculties had been impaired by the two apoplectic fits with which he had been attacked. Had this been the same, the remark ought at least to have been made previously to his appointment to the presidency, but in all probability matters were not as yet ripe for acquiring the influence aimed at, or else it was apprehended that another president would be less tractable. They succeeded by means of certain reports in obtaining the emperor's authority for joining in the agitation which they told him was to be found in the legislative body. These gentlemen had taken the business so much at heart that they were even in dread of shadows. They caused a positive order to be sent to me in very abrupt language, which directed my abstaining from taking any measures with respect to the legislative body, with whom I never was in the habit of interfering except in the exercise of that customary superintendence which it was my duty not to relax in. And I must say it, to the praise of that assembly, I had never witnessed the expression of any sentiments but such as might easily be turned to the advantage of the national welfare. The first measures of those who thus presumed to direct the conduct of the legislative body were perceived in the formation of the committee, in the appointments to the offices of quaestors, and to the other places, the nomination to which is always a result of an election. The assembly directly perceived that it was intended to lead it, and they discovered from the movements of certain individuals whose sentiments were no secret the nature of the influence which was attempted to place as a control over them. There is in man a natural disposition to repel everything derogatory to his dignity, and a public body particularly is apt to recoil at the idea of being led in a direction which it can find out without the aid of a mentor. Those, however, who are accustomed to a life of agitation must ever be like the fly in the fable. Otherwise, they would possess no merit, and all unsuccessful efforts on their part would go for nothing. Notwithstanding that they had calculated upon being rewarded for them, they ought at least to have taken the precaution of remaining in the background and availing themselves of the services of orators known to be devoted to their interests. Their unskillful management prevented all the good that might have been obtained from an assembly, the dissolution of which fully answered the purpose of the allies, who were desirous of tearing asunder the ties which united the emperor to the nation. The assembly yielded to the predominating influence and named as its quaestors the individuals pointed out its choice. But it again resumed its character, unceremoniously rejected every suggestion bearing an official character, and named Monsieur Lenné for its vice president. From that moment, intriguers were at their last gasp, in consequence of the communications which the emperor ordered to be made to the legislative body respecting the state of affairs. The latter appointed a commissioner to examine the documents connected with the Department of Foreign Affairs, which were submitted for its information and proved by the persons which it fixed upon to compose it that it had the will to assert its independence. This could not be imputed to it as a fault it ought not to have been applied to, or else our position should have been laid open to its view with the utmost candor. First, because this was an indispensable duty, and secondly, because it was personally interested in extricating us from our difficulties. Had it even asked for any unjust concessions, they ought to have been granted to it. There could be no dishonor in yielding to the national wish. That assembly, besides, did not call for anything unreasonable. There was not much difference between what it claimed and what the emperor always intended to accede to. It was not difficult, therefore, to establish a mutual good understanding. Nothing more was required than the harsh language used should be softened down to a milder tone, an object so easily attained by a mere turn of phrase, and all difficulties would have been thenceforward removed. The contrary course was adopted. The report of the commission of the legislative body was represented to the emperor as a personal attack against him, and also as the tocsin which was calling out popular assemblies in all directions. He was told that his power would thus be insensibly undermined, that not a moment was to be lost in guarding against the consequences of such hostile intentions. I must acknowledge there was some truth in this opinion, but we could no longer weigh matters with too great a nicety. The emperor wrote to me to desire I would procure the report of the commission of the legislative body, which was printed and intended for distribution at the sitting of the following day. He had strictly enjoined me not to interfere in anything that related to that assembly. This was a word of the wise. I cautiously avoided incurring his displeasure or marring what he intended to do by other means. Those advisors of the emperor who were so warm in their zeal might have procured the report before they allowed matters to go so far. This was, however, on a par with their conduct on every other occasion. I had very fortunately the report by me and immediately sent it to the Tuileries, as it was to make its appearance the next morning. An extraordinary privy council was convened at night and was attended by King Joseph, the high dignitaries, the ministers, and the secretaries of state. The president of the legislative body also attended in the latter capacity. The composition of this council combined everything that could be desired, whether in point of talents or of devotedness to the emperor's service. Monsieur de Bassano, in his character of Secretary of State, read the report of the commission of the legislative body. It is proper to observe that every means had been resorted to some days before for the purpose of letting the commission know what language was expected from it, whether in the statement or in its conclusions. The attempt had failed of success, and the report was now under deliberation at the Privy Council. It must be acknowledged that this document held a language which was revolting to the government, and yet it was a first attack. The emperor allowed everyone to state his opinion. Strong reasons were urged, especially by the arch-chancellor, in favor of the legislative body, but no one would undertake to pledge himself that there did not exist some afterthought of reviving principles, the profession of which had been productive of such deep calamities. On coming to this part of the discussion, everyone recoiled with a feeling of uneasiness, saying that he would not answer for the possible consequences of such an event. etc. The emperor had often complained that in every council which he assembled, the discussions always took the same turn. It seemed as if a catastrophe was foreseen, and that each one felt as much anxiety not to connect his name with it as to guard against its consequences. The emperor returned to the question and asked if, in the existing state of affairs, the view taken by the legislative body would not be productive of more harm than good. He even asked if there might not be ground for apprehending that in case of a military reverse or of the enemies approaching the capital, the assembly would declare itself permanent and seize upon the government. He wished to know if it was considered proof against any hostile influence, whether internal or otherwise, and concluded with these words: "Speak out your sentiments, gentlemen. You have the experience of the revolution. You have seen what have been the consequences to us of the good intentions of the Constituent Assembly. Does the present one afford any better guarantee against its falling into similar errors?" No one dared to affirm it, but all were unanimous in defending the Assembly from the mere suspicion of yielding to any foreign influence. As to an internal one, it must always exist. Events alone would determine the direction it would assume. "In that case," replied the emperor, "I have nothing to hope from it, since it will never come to any decision until fortune shall have already decided. What need have I of that assembly if, instead of giving me the support of its strength, it only throws difficulties in my way? Is this the proper moment, when the national existence is threatened, to speak to me of constitutions and of the rights of the people? In a case analogous to the present state of France, the ancients extended the power of the government instead of restraining it. Here, on the contrary, we are losing our time in trifles, whilst the enemy is at our doors. I was unwilling to trust to my own opinion on this subject, but as I find that the majority agree with me, my resolution is formed, and I will adjourn an assembly which is so little disposed to second me. He immediately signed the decree to that effect and gave me the order to seize every copy of the report of the commission of the legislative body. This measure was adopted on a Friday night and communicated on the body the following day to every member of the legislative body, in conformity with the emperor's orders. I saw the members of the commission. They no doubt felt some uneasiness at calling upon me, as it was probably represented to them that they would become the victims of some acts of violence. I had a very different language to hold to them, and had an opportunity of satisfying myself that if they had been differently dealt with, not only a heavy misfortune would have been averted, but a mighty impulse had been given to the nation by means of such a lever of the legislative body. Several men of talents might also have been discovered amongst its members, who would have been invaluable acquisition to the public service, because hitherto the party who had places at their disposal exclusively selected for them out of the circle of their private friends, these persons introduced their own acquaintances into other places, and so on, an abuse of which I had long been convinced. I was much pleased with the members of the commission of the legislative body. There were no bad intentions amongst them, and it is much to be regretted that the slight ingredient of skill required to establish a harmony of opinions which were not widely different should nevertheless have been wanting. The adjournment of the legislative body created as many different impressions as there are circles of society in Paris. Such an event would have created astonishment under ordinary circumstances. It produced a much more powerful sensation in the present crisis. Some hopes had been built upon the existence of that assembly. They had now vanished. All were deeply mortified at the occurrence. Every endeavor was made to find out what could have given rise to the measure, and as no explanatory details were afforded, imagination wandered in its search after truth, as must always be the case on such an occasion. There must be something, said everyone, which we are not aware of. The emperor must have had a knowledge of some such projects as that of the 23rd of October. Otherwise, he would not have relinquished the advantages he might expect to derive from that assembly. This was the prevailing opinion. It contributed to strike terror into the minds of those persons who had still indulged in hopes of better times. On the following Sunday, the members of the legislative body came to take leave of the emperor according to the customary forms practiced in ordinary cases of closing the sessions. They were introduced to the emperor's apartment by the arch-chancellor. Just as divine service had terminated, the emperor descended from the platform on which the throne was placed, and coming up to the deputies, he spoke to them without anger and addressed them in nearly the following words: "Gentlemen of the Chamber of Deputies, you are on the point of returning to your respective departments. I discovered with unfeigned regret that the spirit of agitation which has broken out amongst you was only calculated to aggravate the misfortunes of the state, instead of affording me the means of overcoming them. I had called you together with the most perfect reliance upon you, and depended upon your concurrence in my endeavors to illustrate this period of our history. You might have rendered a signal service by not separating yourselves from me, by giving me all the support I stood in need of, instead of considering by what means you might contend with me for power, or attempting to confine me within limits which you would be the first to extend when you had discovered the fatal effects of your internal dissensions. Time will show whether those who have given you that impulse had their private interests or the general advantage at heart. I have never been deaf to any representation made to me in favor of the national welfare. And if you had any observations to make to me respecting public liberties, this was not the moment for making them a subject of discussion, since the effect would be to paralyze the enthusiasm of the nation, which it was so essential to foment. By what authority, besides, do you consider yourselves entitled to limit the action of government at such a moment as the present? Have you received from your constituents any right to question the legitimacy of power? Am I indebted to you for the authority which is vested in me? I hold it from God and the people only. Have you forgotten in what manner I ascended the throne you now attack? There existed at that period an assembly like your own. Had I deemed its authority and its choice sufficient for my purpose, do you suppose I wanted the means of obtaining its votes? I have never been of opinion that a sovereign could be elected in that manner. I was desirous, therefore, that the wish so generally expressed for my being invested with the supreme authority should be submitted to a national vote, taken from every person in the French dominions. By such means only did I accept of a throne. This right is very different from any I could ever hold from you. And under no circumstances can you be allowed to make its authenticity the subject of your deliberations. Your power merges into mine from the moment you attempt to exceed the instructions of your constituents. The rights of the throne are beyond your reach because the throne is independent of you. Do you imagine that I consider the throne as nothing more than a piece of velvet spread over trestles? This is a mistake. The throne consists in the unanimous wishes of the nation in favor of the sovereign. As emperor, I stand pledged to its integrity. I will preserve it such as it was handed to me. Otherwise, it would no longer have any attraction and would be wholly unsuited to me. If this should ever cease to be the case, you may then govern yourselves as you think proper. Judge your own acts and consider what circumstances you have chosen for throwing embarrassments in my way. Would there not be some reason for supposing that you are in the service of our enemies? Our position is surrounded with difficulties. By adhering to my views, you might have been of the greatest assistance to me. Nevertheless, I trust, with the help of God and of the army, that I shall extricate myself if I am not doomed to be betrayed. Should I fall in the contest, you cannot escape self-reproach, and you alone will necessarily be ascribed the evils that will desolate our common country. You shall see what it costs to rely upon Punic faith. You may then recall the Bourbons. They alone will be fit sovereigns for you, since you will have renounced your independence, and it will not be binding upon them to cause it to be respected. Some deputies replied to certain passages of the emperor's speech. He listened attentively to them, but did not admit the validity of their excuses and persisted in the sentiments he had expressed. This audience lasted a full quarter of an hour. It was the last that he ever granted to the legislative body. Chapter 25. The emperor, having returned to his apartment, sent for the arch-chancellor, Mr. de Bassano, and myself. He showed no particular indications of displeasure against the legislative body. He complained in general language of the impossibility of constituting an assembly that would candidly follow the impulses given by the government, which it always considered as its enemy, as he observed that it was also with the manifestation of the best intentions towards Louis XVI that they had gradually brought him to the scaffold. He said that the assembly must either have lost their senses or have been desirous of bringing the enemy to France when they could act in this manner, that in either case it would have been dangerous to allow of the existence of this state of things behind him. When he was on the point of proceeding to join the army, where he should find quite enough to engage his attention without having the additional embarrassment of directing the proceedings of such an assembly. Upon asking the arch-chancellor's opinion, the latter replied that he had long ago expressed his sentiments respecting constituted bodies, and he still thought it would be found very difficult to do without them, though he disapproved of the spirit of opposition displayed by a portion of the legislative body, being of opinion at the same time that if a different course of proceeding had been adopted, a misunderstanding, which could only be productive of evils, might have been avoided. I had not the advantage of the arch-chancellor's experience, and the emperor was quite indifferent to my opinion on this subject. He accordingly did not call for it.